to come up here. We're going to see how many of you are geologists. Anybody know what that is? It's what? It's a rock, but what kind of, it's some kind of rock. What exactly? No, it's asbestos. That is asbestos. Now, I wouldn't have known that it was asbestos if I wasn't going to use it as an illustration and Googled asbestos picture. Why did I put that up there? There's some things about asbestos. It's an amazing, it's got some amazing properties. It's fireproof. And because of that, it was used in a lot of buildings and was used in just so many different things. It also was used in fabrics, clothes that people would wear. And for a while, we looked at asbestos and we thought, man, this is a miracle product. This is like the greatest thing. You can put this in a building and now the building won't burn down. And so it was used and used and used until all of a sudden one day they started figuring out there's a problem with asbestos. It causes cancer. But the real problem is, if you ingested asbestos today, you're not going to die of cancer tomorrow. Matter of fact, you probably are not going to get sick for years and years down the road. And the article that I read about asbestos said, not only would you not get sick for years down the road, but when you actually know that you have problems from asbestos, it's almost always too late. That there's nothing you can do to solve the problem. That it's a sickness that just kind of lays dormant. And it almost hides. And you don't realize that you've got a problem until there's really nothing you can do about it. You remember last week we talked about Samson. And we talked about with Samson about how in his father's life there were these problems that kind of showed up. Well, today as we start digging more into the Samson story, we're going to see that Samson had asbestos in his life. You see, Samson had a sickness, an illness in his life that caused problems, but he never realized that he had a problem until it was too late. He never came to an understanding that there was this problem in his life that was going to end up killing him. If you got a Bible, turn to Judges chapter 14. We're going to read this story. It says, Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman there. He went back and told his father and his mother, I have seen a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Now, get her for me as a wife. But his father and mother said to him, Can't you find a young woman among your relatives or among any of our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife? But Samson told his father, Get her for me, because I want her. Now his father and mother did not know this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Suddenly a young lion came roaring at him. The Spirit of the Lord took control of him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. Then he went and spoke to the woman, because Samson wanted her. After some time, when he returned to get her, he left the road to see the lion's carcass, and there was a swarm of bees with honey in the carcass. He scooped some honey into his hands and ate it as he went along. When he returned to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they ate it. But he did not tell them that he had scooped the honey from the lion's carcass. His father went to visit the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, as young men were accustomed to do. When the Philistines saw him, they brought 30 men to accompany him. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said to them. If you can explain it to me during the 7 days of the feast and figure it out, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't explain it to me, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they replied. Let's hear it. So he said to them, Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. After 3 days, they were unable to explain the riddle. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, Persuade your husband to explain the riddle to us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Did you invite us here to rob us? So Samson's wife came to him weeping and said, "You hate me and don't love me. You told my people the riddle, but haven't explained it to me." "Look," he said, "I haven't even explained it to my father and mother, so why should I explain it to you?" She wept the whole 7 days of the feast, and at last on the seventh day he explained it to her because she had nagged him so much. Then she explained it to her people. On the seventh day before sunset, the men of the city said to him, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" So he said to them, "If you hadn't plowed with my young cow, you wouldn't know my riddle now." The Spirit of the Lord took control of him, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men. He stripped them and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. In a rage, Samson returned to his father's house, and his wife was given to one of the men who had accompanied him. You see, Samson has a sickness. And really, I think what we often think of as Samson's weakness, his sickness, I don't really think that was his problem. Because what we typically think of as Samson as his weakness is his weakness for women, specifically women who were not followers of God, Philistine women. And we typically think that's his weakness. But the reality, I think, is that is only a symptom of the weakness, the illness that lived in Samson. And it hung in Samson's life. And it caused him problems. But he didn't realize how big a problem it was until the very end. What was his problem? What was the weakness, the illness, the sickness that lived in Samson? I want you to think about that as we continue to worship. All right, so Samson has a problem. He's got his asbestos. You know, his weakness, his illness, his sickness, let's just call it what it is, his sin that's just lying there in his life. And he really doesn't know what it is. He doesn't even really know that he's got a problem. And he goes down to this city of Timnah one day, and he sees a Philistine, and he wants to get married to this Philistine. And I'm not going to go into detail on it, but let's just say this. This is a bad choice that points to his more important problem. Because if you look closely at the text, if you read this story really close, one of the things that jumps out to you is that Samson has never spoken to this girl, possibly never even spoken to her parents. All he has done is seen her walking somewhere. He's seen her and probably saw her from a distance. But he knows he wants her as his wife. What it points out to me is this is a man who is controlled by his passions, by his wants, and not somebody that is controlled by the will of God. You see, Samson saw her and said, "That's a good-looking woman. I want to marry her." That's all he really knows about. He doesn't know what kind of family she comes from. He doesn't know what kind of person she is. You know, for all he knows, she might have the kind of voice that when she speaks, it just drives him insane. All Samson knows is she's a good-looking woman, and therefore I want her. He is controlled by his passions, by his fleshly desires. Now, in last week's message, we talked about just very briefly that Samson was to be a Nazirite from birth. We're going to talk just a little bit more about what those Nazirite vows are. If you go to Numbers, if you wanted to turn to Numbers chapter 6, from verses 1 through 21, it describes out these Nazirite vows. I'm not going to go back and read them to you. Let me just give you a very quick summary. To summarize the whole thing, that when a person became a Nazirite, they were consecrating or setting themselves apart, separating themselves, making themselves holy to God. And it was a way of having a vow and saying, God, until this vow is completed, I am going to remove myself, and I'm going to separate myself to you and to you alone. And there were some things that they were supposed to do. One, they were to abstain from wine and from beer, from anything, really from anything made from grapes. But the primary idea is to abstain from any kind of intoxicating beverages. Drink none of that. They weren't to cut their hair until their vow was completed. And now a Nazirite vow could be a very short-term thing, or in Samson's case, it was a lifelong vow. And so Samson was to never cut his hair from the time he was born until the time he died. They were not to come into contact with a corpse for any reason. Now this was so strict that if their parents died, they were not to go through the normal mourning rituals, which would have involved touching a corpse. If they were under a Nazirite vow and their parents passed away, they were to just go on as if nothing had happened. No mourning time. Does that give you a little bit of the idea of the seriousness of these vows? I mean, this is a person who is completely separated to God, that God has now become the thing in their life. Not just the most important, but it was it. That's the way Samson was supposed to live. Samson was supposed to be one who was completely dedicated and devoted to God. And all of these things were in addition to the other laws of Moses. You know, just because you were a Nazirite didn't mean that you got to just obey those and set everything else aside. They were still to abide by all of the other laws of Moses. And if you'll remember, one of the laws of Moses is that they are not to marry anyone outside or not part of the Israelite faith. They were not to marry somebody who was not an Israelite. And so Samson, going and marrying a Philistine, he is breaking that vow. Because he's breaking not just that commandment to not marry outside of his faith, not marry outside of Israel, but he also breaks a vow in another way. We'll talk about it in a minute. But Samson just throws his Nazirite vows, throws them away as if they're unimportant. And on the way down to Timnah with his parents, Samson evidently leaves them for a short time. We don't know exactly where it is along the path, but he goes off without them. And during that time, he was attacked by a lion. And the Bible says that he killed this lion as easily as he would have been able to kill a young goat. Given the idea that this was not a contest. I don't know, I haven't fought many lions, but I'm going to assume that if I fought a lion, it would be no contest. It just wouldn't end up the same way it ended up with Samson. And so, it gives us an idea of Samson's incredible strength. So he kills this lion, and then they go on, and I guess, they do the arranging of the marriage. And then, so on his return trip, Samson's going, and he goes, hey, I wonder what happened to that lion. And he goes over, and he checks on it, and he sees the carcass, and he sees inside the carcass a swarm of bees have made a hive. And there's honey in this swarm of bees, in this hive. And so Samson reaches in and gets some of the honey and eats it. Okay, now beyond the fact that that's just kind of gross, Samson has broken his Nazirite vows. Now he didn't break his vow by killing the lion, because it's one of those things. Until it becomes a corpse, he could touch it. But once the lion became a corpse, a carcass, Samson could not touch that anymore. And he couldn't eat anything that would come out of it after it had been killed and not taken care of immediately. And so Samson breaks his Nazirite vows by eating this honey. And you may go, well, Grant, that's no big deal. It really is. Again, it's not just because he broke the vow, but it is because of what it points us to. It points us back to Samson's asbestos. That problem lying deep inside that he hasn't dealt with. And then he makes it even worse, because he doesn't even tell his parents. And you see, eating something, that honey that came out of the carcass of the lion, no Israelite should do that. That broke the law of Moses for all of the Israelites. And so when he goes and he gives it to his parents, not only has Samson sinned himself, but now Samson is giving to his parents and saying to them, you sin. He is causing them to commit a sin. Now they're committing it unintentionally, unknowingly, but it was still sin for them to eat that honey. And so Samson has not only sinned himself, but he passes it on. And he demonstrates through this his lack of concern for the vows that covered his life. And again, Samson was controlled by his desires, his passions, and not by God's will. You see, Samson lived by what felt right, not what was right. In the book of Judges, we see a number of times this refrain, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. Samson is probably one of the best examples of that phrase, that he just did what he thought felt right, what he wanted, and no concern about whether it was what God wanted. There was no concern in him. There was not this passion in his life to live for God. You know, as a church, we have as part of our statement that we wanted to develop fully devoted followers of Jesus, fully devoted followers of Christ. Well, if you look at Samson, you might say that Samson was maybe a devoted follower of God. He would have said that, yes, he was a worshiper of God. He was a servant of God. Samson would have said those things. The problem was Samson wasn't fully devoted. You see, Samson wanted to serve God when it was convenient. And he wanted to worship God when it felt good. And he wanted to live by God's laws when it was easy. But when something came along that looked a little more enticing, Samson wanted to have the opportunity to go run after it. And so Samson's problem is that God was not the consuming passion of his life. Samson didn't live his life saying, what does God want from me? What is going to make God pleased with me? Samson lived his life saying, what's going to feel good? What do I want to do? And I'm sure if you asked Samson, he would have said, well, yeah, you know, I break some rules every once in a while. The Israel, we call it sin. I sin occasionally. But you know, at the end, I'll turn my life around. When it really gets important, when I get older, you know, when I have kids, when I get married, I'll turn my life around and I'll live right. I'll do it right then. But, you know, I'm just going to have fun now. Well, consider this story. A family visited Niagara Falls, and it was the beginning of spring, and there was ice that was coming down the river. As the family was watching, they would watch these large blocks of ice. And he could see that in those blocks of ice that there were the carcasses of dead fish. And he noticed that gulls were coming down and they were landing on these blocks of ice and they were feeding on the fish. But as they would come up close to the falls, the birds would pull their wings and they would fly off and they would escape from going over the falls. But he watched one gull. And this one seemed to delay. It didn't take off when most of them would, because it was eating too much. This was too good. There's too much fish here, man. He was devouring it. And he waited and he waited and he waited until finally he got to the very brink of the falls. And he pulled out his wings to take off. And the bird flapped and he flapped. And he even flapped so strongly that for just a minute, the whole block of ice started to come up. And you thought maybe he's going to escape. But what had happened, when he had landed on that ice, at first his feet, his talons, had melted the ice. and he was eating. But then the ice refroze. And because he waited too long, he went over the falls. You see, in some ways, that's what Samson is. Samson thought, well, I can kind of serve God right now, but I can still have my fun. I can still go out and I can go down and I can do these things that I want to do, and I can chase the women that look good. And then when I get older, I'll be a fully devoted follower of God. And God will be the passion and the priority in my life. But I'm going to have fun now. But Samson made that choice. And time after time, because Samson didn't live fully sold out to God, he paid the price. And not just at the end of his life. Because you see in this passage, we see at the end of it the beginnings of the problems for Samson. His wife is used to obtain the answer to Samson's riddle, kind of foreshadowing for us a future story from Samson's life, the story of Delilah. And in anger and to obtain vengeance, Samson kills 30 innocent Philistines to pay off his debt. That action in itself leads to future problems for Samson that we're going to talk about next week. But in each one of these things, you look at it and you go, for Samson, you might think that his indiscretions, that they won't come back to harm him. You might think, Samson probably thought, well, all of these things that I've done, they're not going to come back and haunt me. They're not going to come back and bring harm to me. And you might think in your own life that not being fully sold out to God, not having God as the priority in your life, that it's really not going to cause any harm. And then, when I get older, I'll turn it on and I'll become a fully devoted follower of Jesus. And man, I'll get active in serving Him, and I'll be active in loving Him and worshiping Him and serving Him, and I'll be active in loving the church and helping people in the church and serving in the church, and I'll be active in serving our community and telling people in our community about who Jesus is. I'll do all that later. But now I just want to have fun. Or will later ever come? You see, with Samson, there's good news. There is good news with Samson. The good news is God used Samson to bring some semblance of justice to the Philistines. Throughout his life, Samson killed a lot of Philistines. And they were people who God had said they need to be removed because they were polluting the people of Israel with their worship of other gods. And so Samson did some good. But if Samson had been a fully devoted follower of Jesus, how much more could he have done? I mean, Samson is an incredible story. I mean, here is a man who is so incredibly strong that he goes down at this story and he kills 30 Philistines by himself. Now we're going to read later that he kills a whole lot more than 30 at one time by himself. Just imagine what Samson would have been able to do if he could have gone to the people of Israel and said, God has called me to help deliver you. God has called me to help you overthrow the Philistines. And that we can get rid of them. And that we can go back and we can worship God and we can serve God with all of our hearts. And we won't have to pay our taxes to the Philistines. We're going to have money to do for ourselves. Imagine if he had been able to do that. But you see, he couldn't. Because he knew that would require sacrifice. And I don't think Samson wanted any part of suffering and sacrifice. He just wanted what felt right. Wanted to live by his passions. At the end of your life, don't be one that God has used to accomplish a little. when He wants you to accomplish great things. Don't be one at the end of your life that you look back and you go, well, I raised a good family. My children are serving God. But my neighbors are still lost. Don't be one that looks and says, I did some good stuff. But God looks and says, yeah, but I wanted so much more. I wanted you to be one that did great things. And all you can say is, I did good things. Samson did some good things. But if he had learned early on to make God the passion, the priority of his life, he would have done even greater things. Take your connection card. And on the back of it, there are two challenges for today. The first one I told you was going to be here, and it's going to be here next week. I will learn to control my passions. And the second one is I will be obedient to God's calling in my life. And not just obedient, but that I will make God's plan the most important thing. That I will make worshiping Him and serving Him and following Him, that I will make it the most important thing in my life. Not so that I can earn any reward, so that I can earn any glory, so that I can earn my salvation, because you can't earn your salvation. But I want to do that because God is so amazing and God has done so much for me. He has given me so much. He has given me more than I can ever imagine. And I can't pay Him back. But I want to live my life in such a way that I want to accomplish great things for Him so that people will see and will glorify God. That ought to be our goal. Our goal shouldn't be so that I want to do enough so that I can be saved. It ought to be that I want to do these things so that God will be glorified. Will you be obedient to God's calling in your life? Those are my challenges for you today. Control your passions and be obedient to God's calling. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, Lord, there are so many things that strive for our attention. We get pulled in so many different directions. But Father, I pray that we would set everything aside to worship You and to serve You, and that You would be the most important thing in our life. And we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.